They mocked his tattered coat, scoffed at his weary steps, and turned away from the scars that told the story of unimaginable sacrifice. To them, he was a nameless wanderer, a shadow of a man society had discarded without a second thought. But beneath the grime and despair was a story of courage. A soldier who risked everything for a man who now wielded the hammer of justice. This was more than a heartbreaking tale. It was a journey of redemption that would leave you breathless with wonder. Today, we explore the life of Samuel Harper, a veteran the world tried to erase. If you're moved by stories of sacrifice, love of country, and gratitude for the brave veterans who shaped our freedom, subscribe. Stories told every day. The sky over Savannah was heavy, a dull gray that pressed down on the ground. A light drizzle fell in whispers, soaking the rough pavement as an old man shuffled forward, his head bowed beneath a faded cap. His old, patched coat clung to his lean frame, weighed down by years of struggle and memory. His boots, mismatched with thinly worn soles, made no sound as he climbed the grand steps of the courthouse. The air was thick with the smell of wet stone, and the distant hum of traffic felt a world apart from the man who carried his entire life in an old backpack. Samuel Harper's hands trembled as he gripped the strap of his bag, not from the cold but from the weight of what lay ahead. He knew what they saw when they looked at him: a vagabond, a troublemaker, a man who had outlived his purpose. But beneath the dirt and scars, beneath the judgment of those who passed him by, Samuel carried a truth they could not see. He had been a soldier, a protector, a man who had faced death to save others. Now, he faced a different kind of battle, one where his enemy was not gunfire or sandstorms, but the cold indifference of a society that had forgotten him. No one paid any attention at first, until he pushed open the glass doors, dragging behind him a tattered backpack, its fabric stained and frayed at the edges. The air carried the smell of damp cloth, old leather, and a life too long on the streets. A woman in a silk scarf wrinkled her nose, her lips curling in disgust as she adjusted the scarf to cover her face. A young clerk turned away with a grimace, eyes narrowed as if Samuel's presence had offended him. Two men in pressed suits backed away, one muttering, "He smells like he's been buried." His companion chuckled. Probably. Their words were deeper than Samuel let on, but he said nothing. His face, deeply lined like a map of grief, betrayed no emotion. He moved toward the courtroom, each step careful, leaving faint smudges on the polished floor. His backpack clanked softly with each step, a quiet, stubborn rhythm that seemed to reflect his determination. At the security checkpoint, a guard named Ethan barely glanced at him. "Remove your cap," he barked, his voice sharp and impatient. Samuel obeyed, his hands shaking as he pulled it off, revealing gray hair matted by the rain. "And the bag," Ethan added, gesturing to his backpack. Samuel hesitated, his fingers lingering on the strap. This bag contained his entire world, his past, evidence of who he had been. Inside were time-tarnished medals, sepia-tinted photographs, and a small notebook where he'd written the names of every soldier he'd lost. To Samuel, the bag was more than a possession. It was a lifeline, a tether to who he had been. But Ethan didn't care. He pushed it aside without thinking, muttering, "Come on." Samuel passed, his shoulders hunched, feeling the weight of every judging gaze. The metal detector beeped faintly as he passed through, but no one bothered to check further. To them, he was invisible, a ghost in a world that had moved on. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere changed as Samuel entered. The chatter died down, replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the creaking of wooden chairs. A little girl tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, "Why do you look so sad?" Her voice was small, but it echoed throughout the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. Her father told her to be quiet. "Don't look, honey," his tone a mixture of embarrassment and pity. Samuel took his place at the defendant's table, alone. There was no attorney yet, just an old coat draped over his shoulders and a name tag that read Harper S. The table was scratched and worn, just like Samuel himself, and he sat with his hands clasped in his lap, as if holding himself back. Across the room, the prosecutor, a sharp young man named Nathan Carter, leaned toward his assistant and sneered. "Is this what we're wasting our time on?" A low laugh, sharp and cruel, cut through the air. Samuel was still staring at the state seal on the wall, its golden eagle a stark contrast to his gray world. He had nothing, no family, no friends, just a name the world had buried, and a backpack full of truths no one would look at. The buzz of the courtroom lights buzzed like a swarm of insects, casting a sterile glow over the beige walls. Judge Theodore Langston entered, his black robes billowing like a shadow, his face as hard as granite. He did not spare Samuel a glance. He thought he knew men like this, or so he believed. Langston had presided over countless cases, and to him, Samuel was just another name on a file, another face in a long line of forgotten men. Samuel lowered his eyes as the bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoing through the room. Case 2.319A, State of Georgia versus Samuel Harper. The room fell into a tense silence as Nathan Carter rose, his gestures polite and confident, adjusting his cufflinks with a grand gesture that spoke of ambition and privilege. "Judge," Nathan began, his voice soft and cool, "the state demands efficiency in this matter. The defendant is a known vagrant, a public nuisance, and a danger to society. His latest actions, attacking a mall security guard, cannot be overlooked simply because he is homeless." He spread his arms in a dramatic gesture, his eyes scanning the gallery for effect. "The law must be fair, but it cannot be weak." Samuel sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap, his breathing shallow. Next to him, his public defender, Emily Dawson, a nervous young woman in her late 20s, fumbled with her notes. She hadn't even asked Samuel to tell her side of the story. She'd been assigned the case that morning and had barely had time to skim the file. Her hands shook as she gripped the pen, her inexperience evident. Nathan continued. "For days ago, Mr. Harper was asked, politely, I might add, to leave Oakwood Mall. Instead, he threw a glass bottle at Officer Daniel Reed, causing a minor concussion. The room murmured, a shock wave rippling through the crowd. A woman in the back gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Nathan's voice sharpened, his words laced with contempt. And while the defendant may have served in Operation Desert Storm, past service is no excuse for present crimes. What stands before you today is not a soldier, but a threat." Samuel's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, but he said nothing. The mention of Operation Desert Storm stirred something deep inside him, a flood of memories he had spent years trying to bury. He could almost hear the roar of the artillery, feel the sting of sand on his skin, smell the acrid smoke that filled the air. But here, in this sterile courtroom, those memories felt like a dream, distant and untouchable. Judge Langston turned to the defendant, his expression unreadable. "Does the defendant have a statement?" Emily stood up, her voice unsteady, cracking under the pressure. "Judge, my client admits the facts and asks for leniency in sentencing. We do not contest the charges." Samuel jerked his head up, confusion and betrayal flashing in his eyes. "That's not," he began, his voice hoarse and weak, like a man who hadn't spoken in years. Nathan cut him off with a sneer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hold it, Mr. Harper. Wait your turn." A few chuckles rose from the bench, the sound like nails on a chalkboard to Samuel. Judge Langston rapped his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "Order," he said, his voice firm but dispassionate. Samuel tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat, coming out as a hoarse whisper. The bailiff gestured for him to sit, his expression impatient. Samuel obeyed, his shoulders slumped, his struggle exhausted. He felt the weight of every gaze in the room, their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. In the back of the room, Deputy Caleb Monroe watched silently, his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze fell on Samuel's backpack, still lying by the courtroom door, abandoned and soaked by the rain. He noted the faded military patches on Samuel's jacket, small, worn symbols of a previous life, and the way the man held himself, with a quiet dignity despite the weight of the world. There was something about Samuel that tugged at Caleb's memory, a faint whisper of recognition he couldn't place. He leaned toward the court clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, and whispered, "What was his name again?" "Harper," the clerk replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel Harper?" The name stirred something in Caleb's memory, like the faint echo of a story he'd heard long ago. He frowned, the pieces still not fitting together, as the courtroom moved forward like a cold, emotionless machine, crushing compassion, memory. Samuel glanced up once, just for a moment, not for help, but to see if anyone was still watching. The room was a jumble of faces, none kind, none familiar. He was alone, as he had been for a long time. The truck rumbled down the rain-slicked road, the fog outside thick and gray, curling like smoke. Inside, Samuel sat cuffed between two officers, handcuffs clamped tight around his swollen wrists. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the clank of chains. No one spoke to him, not even the guards, not even a glance. The truck smelled of rust and sweat, and the cold metal bench pressed against Samuel's back, sending a jolt down his spine. He stared at the floor, his mind drifting back to the life he had known, a life of purpose, of comradeship, of honor. Now, all he had left was this, a number, a prisoner, a man without a voice. The truck hit a pothole, jolting Samuel back to the present, and he winced as the handcuffs dug deeper into his skin. They arrived at Pine Hollow Prison just after noon, its concrete walls towering like a fortress, topped with coils of barbed wire that gleamed menacingly in the dim light. The gates groaned open, slow and deliberate, as if the prison itself were resentful of the arrival of another forgotten soul. Samuel stepped outside, the rain soaking through his boots in seconds, the cold seeping into his bones. The yard was a vast expanse of cracked concrete, surrounded by high walls that seemed to swallow the sky. A guard pushed him forward, gripping him hard and rough. "Keep going, old man," he growled, his breath hot in Samuel's ear. Samuel stumbled, but caught himself, his pride the only thing keeping him upright. Inside, fluorescent lights cast a harsh green glow over the air intake, the air smelling of bleach and despair. Officer Marcus Tate, a burly man with a tan neck, looked up from his clipboard, his expression bored and indifferent. "Name?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Samuel's was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. "Harper." "Samuel." Marcus snorted, his lips curling into a smirk. "Sounds like a lie. Are you sure you belong here, Grandpa?" Laughter came from the air intake window, where two other guards stood watching. Another guard leaned in, his eyes glinting with mockery. "What's he getting punished for?" Breathing too loudly, Marcus sneered, flipping through papers. "Throwing a bottle at him, all cop. I guess he's still got some fight left in him." They laughed again, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls, each chuckle like a knife stabbing into Samuel's chest. He was led to cell B, 22, his steps slow and measured, the weight of reality pressing down on him like a shroud. The cell door clanged open, revealing a gloomy space. Parchment-stained walls, a rusty sink that dripped constantly, and two metal bunks bolted to the floor. The top bunk was occupied by a man in his mid-30s, Jason Carver, his head shaved and the dagger tattoo on his neck that seemed to throb menacingly. He swung down, his boots hitting the floor with a loud thud that echoed throughout the small space. Okay, Jason said, looking at Samuel with a predatory grin. "They said I'd have a new cellmate. Didn't expect a fossil." He stepped closer, his voice mocking, his breath reeking of stale tobacco. "What's your problem, old man? Are you a war hero or just a lost drunk?" Samuel lowered himself onto the lower bunk, his movements slow and deliberate, each movement a silent act of defiance. "I just want to rest," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the dripping of the sink. Jason scoffed, his laugh sharp and cruel. "Rest? You'll have plenty of that here, whether you want it or not." That night, the prison lights dimmed, casting darkness over the cell. The only light, a faint sliver from a flickering bulb in the hallway. Samuel lay awake, the cold metal of the bunk bed biting into his back, sending jolts of pain through his already aching body. His ribs pounded, a reminder of battles fought long ago, both on the battlefield and in the years since. Years of sleeping on the streets, scavenging for food, becoming invisible. Above him, Jason's snores filled the air, a sound of carefree confidence, the kind of arrogance that comes from never having faced real hardship. Samuel reached into the lining of his jacket, his fingers brushing against a small, hidden object, a dog tag, its surface dull with age, the metal cool against his skin. He whispered his name into the darkness, Samuel Harper, as if to remind himself that he still existed. In this forgotten corner of the world, he will have to prove it once again. As Samuel clutched his dog tag, his mind drifted back to 1991, the air thick with sand and smoke in the Kuwaiti desert. He could still hear the screams, the deafening rumble of mortars that shook the ground beneath his feet. He saw Lieutenant Theodore Langston, then a young officer, pinned under the rubble, his leg bleeding profusely, his face pale with shock. "Stay with me, Lieutenant," Samuel shouted, his voice hoarse as he pulled Langston to safety, bullets whizzing past like angry wasps. Sand stung his eyes, heat seared his lungs, but he didn't stop until they were behind a burned-out tank, its metal still hot from the previous explosion. Samuel had torn a strip from his own uniform to bandage Langston's wound, his hand steady despite the chaos around him. He recalled the faces of those he had failed to save, Private Daniels, who had been hit by a bullet just yards away, Corporal Evans, whose laughter had echoed throughout their camp the night before. Memories burned, a mixture of pride and pain, as he recalled the names of each man he had lost, their voices echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. The morning siren in Pine Hollow screeched like a demon, the cell doors opening in a metallic melee that woke Samuel from his restless sleep. He rose slowly, his joints creaking like old machinery, each movement a reminder of the time that had passed. Another day in this gray, emotionless place where hope was as rare as sunlight. Jason hopped out of bed, already smirking, his eyes flashing with malice. "You look like death warmed over, Grandpa. Maybe tell the guards you're done. They can throw you out with the trash." Samuel didn't answer, his silence a shield against Jason's cruelty. He pulled on his jacket, the fabric rough against his skin, and joined a stream of prisoners heading for the canteen, a sea of orange jumpsuits moving like a slow, reluctant river. At breakfast, he sat alone, his tray holding a lump of cold oatmeal and a slice of bread hard enough to be used as a weapon. He did not eat, his eyes staring into the distance, lost in thought, the gray porridge on the tray reflecting the grayness inside him. Across the room, a group of young prisoners watched him like wolves, their whispers sharp and conspiratorial. One leaned toward Jason, his voice low but eager. "That's him." Jason nodded, a sly smile on his face. "Yeah, thinks he's better than us. Remind him where he is." They moved as a pack, their trays slamming into Samuel's desk, sending oatmeal splattered across his jacket in a cold, sticky mess. Another tray dropped a loaf of bread onto the floor, where it skidded across the dirty concrete. Jason stood, arms crossed, grinning like a cat toying with a mouse. "What's the matter, soldier? No fight left in you." Samuel looked up, eyes tired but unwavering, a quiet strength deep within him that Jason couldn't quite place. One of the men leaned forward, his voice growling, his breath hot and sour. "Say something, old man." Samuel said nothing, so they pushed him. He staggered, fell to the floor, his head hitting the edge of the chair with a sickening thud. A thin line of blood ran down his temple, staining his tan skin red. The guards watched but turned away, their laughter mixing with that of their fellow inmates, a cacophony of desolation filling the canteen. Samuel lay there, not because he couldn't get up, but because he was tired of getting up only to be knocked down again. The concrete was cold against his cheek, the blood warm as it dripped onto the floor, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of it all. The years of rejection, the nights of hunger, the loss of everything he'd ever held dear. But then he remembered his dog tag, the names he'd whispered in the dark, and he found the strength to pull himself up, his movements slow but determined. Blood dripped onto the concrete as he limped back to his cell, each step a silent vow to keep going, no matter how heavy the burden. In the hallway, Deputy Caleb Monroe was pinning up homework, his clipboard piled high with names and numbers. He saw Samuel pass by, bruised and bleeding, blood standing out against his pale skin. "Hey," Caleb called softly, his voice filled with concern. Samuel stopped, barely turning, his body tense with exhaustion. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, stepping closer. Samuel's eyes, puffy with exhaustion, met his for a moment. He nodded weakly, not in answer, but in resignation, and kept walking. Caleb's jaw clenched, a feeling of anger and guilt rising in his chest. He wanted to do more, but the shout of a sergeant down the hall, "Monroe, don't hold back," drove him away. Back in his cell, Jason lay sprawled on the bed, a cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling lazily in the dim light. "Don't bleed on my side," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. Samuel sat silently, pressing a rag to his head, the cloth quickly soaking with blood. He had been a soldier, a man others had relied on for strength, a man who had carried wounded comrades through hell. Now he was nothing but a target, cast away again, his past reduced to a joke. The walls of his cell seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the weight of isolation. And for the first time in years, Samuel felt tears sting his eyes, not for himself, but for the men he had lost, who would never know how far he had fallen. The next day, as Samuel sat alone in the canteen, his food tray untouched, an elderly prisoner named Henry slid down the bench across from him. Henry was a thin man in his 60s, limping from an old war wound and with a scar on his cheek that told the story of survival. Yet his eyes were kind and his voice was deep, almost gentle. "I saw what they did to you yesterday," he said, his tone carrying the weight of shared experience. "It takes courage to keep quiet like that. Are you a veteran?" Samuel nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. "Desert Storm," he answered, his voice hoarse. Henry's face softened, a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "Me too. No, we don't fall apart easily, do we?" For the first time in days, Samuel felt a warm glow, a shared understanding that gave him the strength to face another day. Henry leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have more fight than they know, Harper. Don't let them take that from you." Samuel gave a small, grateful nod, the connection a lifeline in the darkness of Pine Hollow. The infirmary smelled of antiseptic and damp air, so strong it stung Samuel's nose. Nurse Margaret Ellis, a silver-haired, serious-looking woman, cleaned the gash across Samuel's temple, her movements precise but gentle. "It needs stitches," she said, more to herself than to him. Her brow furrowed as she examined the wound. Samuel didn't flinch, his gaze fixed on a crack in the ceiling, the jagged line mirroring the cracks in his life. Margaret sighed, taking in the scars on his arms, the faint outline of shrapnel near his shoulder, the marks of a man who had survived more than most could imagine. "You saw combat, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft. "Desert Storm," Samuel answered softly, the words heavy with memory. "2nd Battalion, Steel Crows." Margaret paused, her hand stilling. "Crows? My brother was with them, James Carter. He talked about a sandstorm ambush in '91. Samuel's eyes flashed with recognition, a glimmer of connection in the desperation. James always carried a picture of his daughter in his helmet. Margaret's hand froze, the gauze trembling against her fingers. "It was him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He said a man named Harper saved him, pulled him out of a burning ditch." Samuel looked down, his voice barely audible, the memory a burden he could barely bear. "I only did what I had to do." Margaret's eyes softened, a tear glistening in the corner of her eye. "He died 2 years ago, but he never forgot you. Said you put him through hell." Samuel said nothing, the memory too heavy to hold, the pain of loss mingling with the faint pride of having saved a life. "Does anyone here know who you are?" she asked, her voice a mix of anger and sadness. "No," He answered, his tone resigned. And they don't want to know. Margaret handed him more bandages before he left, touching his hand briefly. You need a quiet place? I'll save you some, she said, her voice firm but kind. Samuel nodded, his throat tightening. Thank you, he whispered, the words holding more gratitude than he could muster. As he left the infirmary, he passed Deputy Caleb, who was pushing a file cart down the hall, the wheels squeaking on the concrete. Their eyes met, and Caleb nodded, a small gesture of respect. Mr. Harper, he said, his voice low. Samuel paused, his body tense with exhaustion. I looked at your file, Caleb said quietly, his eyes searching Samuel's face. The Silver Star for Valor. Why didn't you say anything? Samuel smiled wearily, the corners of his mouth barely turning up. Would it have made any difference? Caleb looked away, embarrassed, his hands clasped on the cart. Probably nothing, he admitted, but maybe someone listened. No one listens to ghosts, Samuel said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth, and walked away, his steps slow but steady. That evening, Caleb sat at his desk in the dimly lit office, staring at Samuel's file. Samuel R. Harper, Sergeant, Army 1991 to 1994. A record of valor spread before him. Medals, rescue missions, wounds sustained, each entry a testament to a man who had given his all for his country. This man had carried soldiers through hell, had faced death without flinching, and now he was being humiliated on a tray of leftovers, his heroism reduced to nothing. Caleb's chest tightened with anger and determination, his fingers tracing the faded ink of Samuel's quote. He picked up the phone, his voice flat but urgent. Hey, he said to the night supervisor, a gruff man named Daniels. Can we have access to the courthouse evidence locker? The voice on the other end sighed, the sound crackling over the wire. For what? A backpack, Caleb said, his tone firm. It belonged to a man who didn't belong here. The line was silent, a silence heavy with possibility. Samuel returned to his cell, lying on the cold bunk as Jason turned away with a groan, his back to the indifferent wall. In the darkness, Samuel whispered the names of the fallen. James, Michael, Ethan, his only companions in a world that had forgotten him. The names were a prayer, a requiem, a reminder of why he kept going, even when every step felt like a battle. The cell was silent except for the trickle of the sink, a steady rhythm that mirrored Samuel's own heartbeat, slow but unwavering. The next morning it rained again, turning the prison yard into a muddy mess, the ground slippery and treacherous. Samuel sat alone on a rusty bench outside the laundry, his hands shaking as he tried to patch a tear in his sleeve with a piece of thread he had found, his breath visible in the cold air. The yard was deserted, the other prisoners huddled in groups, their laughter and shouts a stark contrast to Samuel's solitude. No one approached him, their eyes passing him by as if he were a shadow, a ghost among them. But across town, someone had not forgotten. In a small office downtown, Deputy Caleb Monroe hunched over his desk, a military document scanned across the screen. Department of the Army Distinguished Service Award. Signature below, Lieutenant Theodore Langston. Caleb's heart was pounding, the pieces finally falling into place. He dialed, his hand unsteady, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Judge Langston's office. A voice answered, sharp and professional. This is Deputy Monroe from Pine Hollow, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. I need to speak to the judge. About Samuel Harper. There was a pause, the rustling of papers on the other end of the line. The judge is unavailable, the secretary answered, her voice sharp. Caleb's tone hardened, his resolve unwavering. Tell him this. Samuel Harper saved his life during Operation Desert Storm, July 1991, Outpost Alkari. If it means anything, he'll call me back. He hung up, pulse pounding, the weight of what he just said in motion weighing him down. Back in Pine Hollow, Samuel faced another day of torture, the prison walls seeming to close in tighter with each passing hour. Jason and his men cornered him in the laundry room, the air heavy with the smell of detergent and sweat. The machines droned menacingly. Still think you're a hero? Jason sneered, pushing Samuel against the wall, the rough concrete pressing against his back. A fist slammed into Samuel's stomach, and he collapsed, gasping for air, the pain sharp and burning. The other prisoners laughed, their voices cruel in unison, as Jason grabbed Samuel by the collar, his eyes flashing with malice. "You're nothing here, old man," he hissed, his breath hot in Samuel's face. The guards, as usual, looked the other way, their indifference a silent endorsement of the violence. Samuel's hope diminished with each passing day, the weight of isolation growing heavier, each blow a reminder of how far he had fallen. He clutched his stomach, his breath coming in short gasps, his vision blurred with unshed tears. But somewhere, deep inside, a glimmer of resilience flickered, fueled by the memory of the men he had fought for, the lives he had saved. He would not fall. Not yet. The days dragged on, each a mirror image of the past, the torment relentless. Samuel's body bore the marks of Jason's cruelty, bruises on his arms, a cut above his eye that refused to heal, a limp that grew more pronounced with each step. But his spirit, though broken, refused to break. He thought of Henry's words, of the quiet strength they'd shared, and he pressed on, waiting for a change he couldn't name, but could feel, like a distant storm on the horizon. And then, finally, in Judge Langston's office, a clerk entered with a file, his expression urgent. "Sir, you need to see this." Langston's eyes widened at the name, Samuel Harper. Below is the quote, "Rescuing Lieutenant Theodore Langston during a mortar attack, July 1991. The judge's face paled, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered, memories flooding back, the sandstorm, the blood, the voice shouting, "Stay with me." He had never known the man's name, only that he owed his life to a soldier's bravery. Langston picked up the phone, his voice shaking, his hands shaking as he dialed. "Cancel my schedule," he told his agent, his voice hoarse. "Give me the Harper file, everything." An hour later, the prison intercom blared, the sound sharp and piercing in the silence of the cell block. "Prisoner Harper, Samuel, prepare for transfer. There is a summons to appear in court immediately." Samuel looked up, confused, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaking. The guard didn't answer, just tightened his handcuffs on Samuel and pushed him toward the gate, the grip rough but effective. Outside, the rain had not stopped, the sky was as gray as ever, but there was something in the air that felt different. Samuel couldn't name it, but after so many years of silence, someone finally remembered. The courthouse was transformed as Samuel stepped out of the truck. There was no snickering, no rough hands. Deputy Caleb Monroe waited on the steps, holding a dark green coat. "It's cold," he said softly, draping it over Samuel's shoulders. "Thought you'd like to come in properly." Samuel looked at him, wary but grateful, and nodded. Inside, the marble floors gleamed, and reporters lined the hallways, whispering respectfully. Some lowered their cameras as he passed, a quiet gesture of respect. They reached courtroom 4. Judge Theodore Langston waited, dressed in a simple suit, his face pale, holding a trembling file in his hand. Samuel paused in the doorway. Their eyes met, and 30 years melted away. Langston spoke first, his voice breaking. "It was you. You pulled me out of that wreckage." Samuel said nothing. "I never knew your name," Langston continued, his voice breaking, "until now." In front of the entire room, Langston stepped forward and knelt, head bowed. The room gasped. "I judged you without seeing you," Langston said. "I let my pride blind me. But you saved my life." Samuel's voice was soft. "I didn't do it for thanks." "I know," Langston whispered. "But I owe you everything." Langston stood up and turned to the clerk. "Void the conviction. Clear the record. Free his assets now. And add his name, Samuel R. Harper, to the Hall of Valor." Tears fell from the clerk, Sarah Bennett, as she handed Samuel his backpack. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, placing it in his hands. Samuel held it tightly, his eyes shining. Inside were his memories, medals, photos, names, pieces of his soul. When he left, his name was etched into the wall of heroes, a promise Savannah would never forget. A week later, the Hall of Valor was ablaze with morning light. Veterans, families, and children filled the space, their faces lit up with reverence. In front, a bronze plaque glowed. Samuel R. Harper, Sergeant, United States Army, Desert Storm, man to be remembered. Samuel sat in the front row, wearing a new suit given to him by a group of veterans, his backpack at his side like a loyal companion. Judge Langston stepped up to the podium, his voice even. We are here not only to honor a soldier, but also to confront our own failures. We do not see the hero before us, but he never stopped carrying his truth. Langston stepped down, walked towards Samuel, and saluted him, a slow, sincere gesture. The crowd followed, raising their hands, veterans and children alike, until the room was filled with honor. Samuel stood, clutching his backpack. "I'm not special," he said softly. "I just want to be remembered." He looked at the plaque, then at the crowd. "And now I am." The applause was soft but warm, like a gentle dawn after a long night. Samuel's journey reminds us of the heroes among us, the veterans who sacrificed everything for our freedom, often forgotten in the shadows. Take a moment to reflect. Who in your life has sacrificed for you? Share their story in the comments or reach out to a veteran in your community to say thank you. Together, let's honor their courage and keep their legacy alive. Outside, on the courthouse lawn, two children stared at the name on the wall. Who was he? One asked. A hero they had almost forgotten, but not forgotten, the other replied. Nearby, Samuel sat on a bench in the sunlight, no longer a ghost, but a man whose name rang with pride. Stories told every day. We're committed to bringing you stories like Samuel's, stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the restorative power of the human spirit. We're close to 1,000 subscribers, and your support can help make it happen today. Comment below with your thoughts, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and together, let's keep these stories alive. Time is running out. Take action now, because every story matters, and so does your voice.